Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Matthew Mee from Emsi, as Al said. For those of you that don't know us, we're a labour market intelligence business operating for about 20 years, based out of the US. If we go to the next slide, if that's okay. Just a little bit about what we do. So we work with a whole array of different sectors, more than 1,500 clients across the globe. We curate and put together labour market data from an array of sources that starts with government data in various countries across the planet. And then we augment that with a number of big data sets from job postings, social profiles, education, curriculum, etc. So that's a little bit about what we do. Next slide, if that's okay. I guess rather than talking purely about our products today, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about, we're all facing slightly surreal circumstances when we look at the working world. So the first thing that we've done as an organization is obviously put out a cry for help and work out, well, how can we use our data sets to help the wider world, our customers, our local communities. And there's obviously a huge amount of data that's available to all of you for free on various websites. So I encourage you to check that out, to see if information is on there that's relevant. We've had a huge number of inquiries from customers and new audiences, in fact, over the last few weeks. So we're playing our part very much, and that's right from our CEO down at the core of what we're trying to do. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So today I want to talk about a few things, really. So we see that our role in sort of enabling that change and sort of helping organizations understand where we are on this journey is in four key areas. So one is about understanding demand, what's happening in the job markets today. Second is how do we measure and assess the economic impact of what's happening? Obviously, none of us are at the end of the journey yet, and there's a number of things that we can do and have been doing to help organizations assess, well, what might this look like in coming weeks and months? So I'll talk a little bit about that. The other is looking at supply side of the labour market, so what's happening there and what data is there available, and then how do we use some of the tools that we've got to enable a speedy recovery. If we move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk through a scenario and give you some data on what we're seeing going on in the UK labour markets, and then a little bit on international labour markets. So hopefully this is useful information for you. Since sort of early March, we've seen a drop in the UK in terms of job posting activity. So a really interesting measure when it comes to what's happening in terms of job activity, hiring activity. That's dropped by about 55% since the beginning of March. And if you can see the screens on the top right, that's actually had a number of different themes in different regions across the UK. So with the Northwest and various other regions dropping slightly lower than areas like London. And we've also seen against that average of 55% drop that certain industries and sectors are more greatly affected than others. So particular, and no surprises here, food, accommodation, services, looking at the sports industry, looking at retail. Next slide, please. But what we've also seen is that demand insight is actually proving to be a really good indicator of what's going on in the economy. So from a key workers perspective, there's been a huge amount of data and a huge increase in the level of hiring for certain roles in the key workers sector. So that includes care workers, it includes obviously in nursing, in some of the storage occupations, companies like Amazon, etc. So a really strong indicator that demand data can give you a really good insight as to what's actually happening into the economy. Now, at the moment, obviously, that's all pretty much doom and gloom news. But what we're really interested in seeing is how can we use this insight and this data in terms of giving us an indicator of what the recovery is going to look like. So if you see the chart on the bottom right-hand side, that shows the balance of how job postings works in terms of postings that are expiring and new postings that are being put out to the internet. And you'll see there's a slight peak and emergence in the last week or so, just on the right-hand side there, that demonstrate there might be some signs of recovery happening, and it's too early to really tell that. But what we're going to be monitoring over the next few months is really roles, the organizations that are hiring, what locations in the economy are really starting to recover. Interestingly, skills and pay levels, and I think very importantly from the earlier talent intelligence conversation, what's changing in work patterns? Are people shifting locations and more people working from home. So all that's the kind of insight that Emsi data can help bring to organizations. If we can move on, please. So demand, really interesting area. I mentioned economic impact. So we've published, and if you want to check out our chapter channel on the PAFOW website, a number of economic impact reports, both in the US and the UK. This is an example, and it's a report that's up on that chapter around the restaurants and pub sector across the UK that looks initially at what's the size of that economy in terms of the employees that sort of work in the sector, the level of income that is created, the earnings that are created through the sector, and then we model a number of scenarios through these reports that look at again what might happen to that sector in terms of the lost earnings that could transpire if that sector remains closed for a period of time, and obviously that has transpired to be the case. And then we can model a number of different economic scenarios for different industries around if there is a shock to the economy, which there is now, what might that look like, which we think is going to be really useful insight for business leaders, for people, and particularly in local government, looking at what's the real impact of the changes we're seeing happening going to be on our local economies and then on a sort of other scale. Move on, please. The supply side of the economy is really interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first two categories there. So at the moment, we're starting to see some data being released in the UK about furloughed workers, about claimant counts. Profiles is a really interesting area. We obviously produce profiles data, but obviously what we're expecting to see is a lag of changes in profiles. It's people aren't necessarily going to be wanting to share bad news or that they're in a change of circumstances at this time. But over the course of the next few months, we're going to see, it's going to be interesting to monitor as well, number of job applications, how that changes per role, perhaps business closures. If we can move on, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about furloughed workers. So for those of you that haven't seen it, so the first results came out from the ONS last week, which was the business impact of COVID-19 survey. About 82% of the 6,000 or so participants said that they've been furloughed, which is a very early indicator of what's happening in the UK right now. And you'll see a number of interesting sector insights there. So, the education sector showing only at 22%. Some interesting data that doesn't quite ring true, the healthcare sector, saying that 90% of their workers have been furloughed. But other sectors obviously looking like they're at more significant risk, particularly if you look at information and communication, with 5% suggesting that they'd already been through redundancy. If we could move on, please. And then if we look at universal credit claims, so this is really interesting for those of you in the UK. We have a transition period to universal credit, currently just peaking over 3 million people claiming universal credit in some shape or form. And you can see the peaks that happened both from households and individuals over the course of the last few months, particularly in March, so a really intense period other than the weekends in March. That it's going to be interesting if we roll on to the next slide, how this data translates as we look at the full labour market in context of the regions across the economy. Next slide, please. So here we can see how that universal credit landscape looks in terms of the different government office regions across the UK, sort of with London and the northwest of England. But as we see the true impact of COVID in the UK economy, we're obviously going to see some changes in this data. Move on, please. That's okay. Lastly, and I guess from a data perspective, we run a product called Emsi Global, and that looks at labour market data across approximately 47 countries at the moment. And what our data science team have been doing in the US is looking at some of the unofficial data sources. This is from over 100 different sources across currently 27 countries, although that's growing by the day. What we think unemployment impact might be as a result of COVID-19 in different countries. You can see that there are some serious spikes there in terms of levels of growth. Now that creates obviously a great deal of concern for us as a sort of the working world, but also creates an opportunity in the organisational world of going, we're going to be moving from what's been a very tight labour market for the last number of years to perhaps something with more opportunity to acquire talent and key skills in areas that have been difficult to do so in previous times. We could move on to the final slide, please. So a couple of things. I mean, obviously a very tough time. It's there are significant worries facing the planet right now in terms of the working world. But one of the things that we're interested in, and hearing the earlier conversation as well, we think there's a number of ways to help navigate the way through this journey. We've launched earlier, at the end of last year, a program that's called Emsi Skills. And if we think about people needing to transition into new careers, people needing to think about, well, where will they go next? So Emsi Skills is an open platform for everyone to use. There's a whole range of use cases around it that I'll summarize quickly, but it's a library of 30,000 skills, all built from real data around the job market, profiles and postings. Our CEO talks very passionately about this is the year of 1,000 experiments. We're running some of those experiments right now. So one, how can we help individuals progress to get the skills that they need in their careers? Skills Match is a new tool that we just launched to do that. And then from the corporate slant, thinking about, how do you understand and look at your organization through a skills lens? So what are your competitors up to in terms of their skills attraction and their profile of their organization? And also, what does your own organization look like in terms of skills? So if any of you are interested to have a conversation about how we might try and experiment to look at skills in your own organization, we'd love to talk to you. Final slide, please. So here to help is the key message. If you need support, do reach out. My email address, contact details are there. Thanks to Al and David and the team for organising a great PAFOW conference yet again, and keep safe, everyone.